Hello, this is René Haveman with Farm Future News, episode 14. Today we will talk about soil management, organic matter, how to improve it, and what are nutrients and where do they work for, and how can we understand what the crop needs. We'll go in a deep dive in soil science, and I hope you will enjoy it. If you enjoy it, please like this video and subscribe for this channel because what we can do, we can produce good videos, but we cannot increase the number of subscriptions without your support. Thank you. First, I want to show you a video about the role of organic material in the soil. Organic material is that component in the soil that can be digested and that can deliver nutrients and that can absorb water, that can function as humus, that can provide soil organisms food, and that can also provide the plant with necessary nutrients. Please see first this introduction video.
Last few years, we've gotten a lot of questions about how can we build organic matter in soil. As a farmer, you know how important organic matter is. It basically kind of cushions your soil. It's like a sponge in your soil also to hold water and nutrients until your crop needs it. It is just incredibly important for overall soil health. So today we will talk about how you can build organic matter levels in the short term and the long term on your farm.
All right, let's start with the big thing first, tillage. We get a lot of questions about tillage. Hey, should I work more of that residue into my soil or should I quit working the ground entirely? Well, if you quit working the ground entirely, that would be the best thing you could do if you want to try to build organic matter quickly. Now, at that point, some people say, wait a second here, don't I want to put some of that organic material from the top of the soil down in? Isn't that what's going to build things? Actually, it kind of works the opposite way. If you start working the ground and putting more of that organic material off the top of the ground in, you're actually putting a whole bunch of oxygen down into the soil too. And it really is like adding fuel to the fire, and it starts burning it up quicker. So sometimes people will say, well, I hadn't done tillage for a while, then I did some full-scale tillage and it really improved my yields. It probably did because a lot of the nutrients that were tied up in that residue now got broken down fast. So reducing tillage is important. Leaving that root mass intact underneath the soil is really the key. When you think about a big tall corn plant, about half of the plant material is above the surface and about half is below. And if you leave it untilled, that's where you can really build organic matter.
Okay, so reducing tillage, you don't necessarily have to go no-till, but reducing tillage is important. The next thing is, Darren just mentioned corn and its roots. I want you to think about every plant you could possibly raise in your farm and what Darren just said. Half of all the plant mass is going to be above ground, half is below ground. So what's the biggest plant above ground? Well, for most people, that's probably corn. So that plant is going to have the most roots. If you want to build organic matter faster in the short term, and really in the long term, you should plant crops with lots of roots. Corn on average has 5 times the root mass of a soybean plant, so corn would be a better choice than soybeans. Now, I'm not saying don't ever raise soybeans or you can't build organic matter using soybeans. You can, but it's just going to go faster when you plant corn.
One other practice that really helps building organic matter quicker is adding manure. When you think about fertility and adding the right plant food for your crop to grow, there are a couple different ways you can do it. Well, there's many different ways you can do it, but the two probably most common ones are adding commercial fertilizer or adding manure. When you think about manure, there is a lot of organic material in that manure, and you can start building organic matter quicker. What is manure? Well, it's animal waste, right? And what is organic matter? Well, it's the decayed or decaying plant or animal residue. So as you're adding manure out to the field, normally we're putting on multiple tons per acre, and that's a good way to quickly build up organic matter levels out in your soils.
Another practice that's really caught on here in just the last few years has been the use of cover crops. The more months out of the year that you can keep a cover on that soil, the better off you are. So obviously you're going to reduce erosion, and everybody knows that. But in addition to that, like we say, the more you can have roots growing in the soil, and then eventually when that plant dies, the roots will break down, and most of those roots, or many of those roots, will end up becoming organic matter. That's a great thing for the long term. So use cover crops. Now, which cover crop you're going to use, it obviously can make a difference. So you can just look at, there are charts out there. We have some even at agphd.com under our resources tab, talking about which cover crops are best for building organic matter. But almost anything you raise is a lot better than nothing. So that's the big thing I guess I would say, especially if you have some growing season left in the fall after you've taken a crop off.
So for organic material, you are not without a role to play. As a farmer, you can build up your organic material slow. It's not a fast process, but with the correct management interventions, you can build your organic material. Plowing is burning most of the time your organic material. No plowing is a far better solution. Maintain the organic material on top of your soil. It provides like a blanket to prevent the sun to burn all your nutrients out of the soil. That's one step. The second step is if you have insufficient nutrients, what nutrient do I have to supply in the form of fertilizer or an animal dung? First, we talk about nitrogen. Nitrogen is, its abbreviation is the capital letter N, and it's one of the most important ingredients for plant feed. And in this video, we focus on maize. What role this nutrient plays in feeding maize.
Today we're going to talk about the most commonly asked questions we get about nitrogen rates.
First of all, how much nitrogen does your corn actually need?
Well, what we encourage you to do is download the free Ag PhD fertilizer removal app. You can choose your crop and your yield goal, and then it will tell you how much total nitrogen you need.
Well, one of the big questions that we get, Brian, every year is, how about the soybean credit? I had soybeans out there last year. Am I going to get a lot of nitrogen for free?
Well, you're going to get some nitrogen most likely, but the thing is, there's no such thing as a soybean credit. It doesn't exist. It's a made-up thing. Here's where I'm going with this. Sometimes after soybeans, we have 100 pounds of nitrogen left. Other times when we plant soybeans and we go into corn, we have 10 pounds of nitrogen left. A lot of our tests from last fall showed 10 pounds left. Okay, so what's it going to be? Well, if you're just going to assume, oh, I raised 40 bushel beans, so I have 40 pounds, you're just guessing. Okay, we want you to soil test, then you actually know. So don't just assume because I raised soybeans, I have a whole bunch of nitrogen. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't.
One of the big concepts we talk about very often is a soil's cation exchange capacity, or CEC. Can you explain that just a little bit?
Yep, so cation exchange capacity is just the holding capacity of your soil. But what it also tells you is how much nitrogen your soil can hold. And this isn't an exact number or anything like that, but it'll get you close. Just take 10 times your CEC. So if your cation exchange capacity is 12, 12 times 10 is 120, we're going to tell you that at most your soil can hold 120 pounds of nitrogen at any one time. So if you already have 40 pounds out there, we would tell you don't put any more than 80 pounds out there right now.
All right, and that's a really important number to know because we want to get the right amount of nitrogen. We don't want to lose it to leaching, and leaching is one of those concepts we get a lot of questions, especially on a wet spring like this.
Well, there are three different forms of nitrogen loss. You've got volatility, where you lay it out on the soil surface and then it can go up in the air. So we've got that concern. Leaching is when it goes down in the ground and then it ends up possibly in somebody's groundwater, so we have to worry about that. The third type of loss is one that a lot of people don't think about often, that's denitrification. But for example, for us, we have some really heavy soils that sometimes get saturated. Well, if you have a heavy soil that gets really saturated, you might not have leaching, but what you might have is you lose your nitrogen to denitrification. So these are the three types of loss. These are the three things you can protect from by using a nitrogen stabilizer if you pick the right one, because certain stabilizers will protect from one, but not from another form of loss.
One of the most misunderstood things when building soil fertility recommendations with pretty much everybody I've talked to is organic matter mineralization. And people just aren't factoring that in, Brian, but it's
Exactly.
a big deal.
So a lot of people will say, oh, you have a soybean credit, which isn't true. But then the other side is they say, well, that's all I'm figuring. I got a soybean credit, I got my yield goal, done. No, you've got one more factor in there, and that is organic matter mineralization. The more organic matter you have, the more free release of nitrogen you'll have. Usually in the United States, we figure 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen for every 1% of organic matter. So in other words, if I had 5% organic matter, that's 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen that will come available all during the growing season. And it comes available based on heat. So is any going to be available in April or May in our area? No. But is it going to be available, some of it in July? Yes. Some of it in August? Yes. Some in September? Yes, because that's when the heat comes.
Finally, Brian, we need a little bit of a chemistry lesson here because there's a lot of questions on different forms of nitrogen. What's the difference between the ammonium that we're often talking about and nitrate?
Yeah, so we should have talked about this a little bit earlier when we discussed leaching. The thing you got to understand is your soil is negatively charged. Nitrate, when it's in that form, that is negatively charged. Negative and a negative repel. Of course nitrate's going to leach. On the other hand, ammonium is positively charged. A positive and a negative attract, so the ammonium is not leachable. That's the form that the plants prefer anyway, so we would like to keep nitrogen in the ammonium form longer. That's just another thing that most nitrogen stabilizers can do.
As you're building your nitrogen program for your corn crop this year, start off with the free Ag PhD fertilizer removal tool. Type in what your yield goal is for your farm. It'll give you an idea of where to start with how many pounds you're actually going to need. Then you'll build that out with your applied nitrogen, nitrogen that's carried over from last year's crop that'll show up on your soil test, and then also looking at soil organic matter and estimating your release.
The second nutrient we want to talk about is phosphorus. Phosphorus is a very crucial nutrient for root mass development and for making the crop resilient to drought. Many of the farmers in Africa, they spread their fertilizer on top of the soil. After they have planted their seed, they add the fertilizers on top of it. Many countries in Africa have huge amounts of rain, and the rain is responsible for making the phosphorus go down the drain to the lowest point of the slope and in the rivers and creeks. That's why it is important to put your phosphorus in a deeper layer of the soil. Make sure you can place it at least around the 10 to 14 centimeters in the soil, but not in the top of the soil. That's very important. Please watch and listen to the next video.
doesn't move at all in many soils around the world.
Yes, this one particular nutrient doesn't move like you're going to find nitrogen moving or boron or sulfur. So we have to manage phosphorus a lot differently for a couple of reasons. First of all, we get really worried about phosphorus moving into water. Phosphorus is the #1 water quality issue we have in the United States today. It's not nitrate. I mean, don't forget about nitrate, but it is not nitrate. It is phosphorus. So here's the thing. When we know it doesn't move in soil, I want you to think about this for a second. If you were to place all your phosphorus down even 2 or 3 or 6 inches deep, how's it going to get into water? It's not, because it doesn't leach in soil. The only exception I would say to that is when we have lighter soils and when you have thousands of parts per million of phosphorus, yes, then it's possible your phosphorus could be a little soluble. But when we're talking about heavy ground, not a lot of rainfall, and normal levels of phosphorus, 100 parts per million, 200 parts per million, you're not finding phosphorus move at all. It takes decades for it to move an inch or two.
Well, how are we getting phosphorus to move in soil? You may say, well, I broadcast my phosphorus out in my fields. Am I in trouble? I'm tilling it in. How deep will I actually be able to move it? Let's say that your tillage tool is working at a 5-inch soil depth, or let's say 6 inch, just for a round number. If you're tilling 6 inches deep, typically we're only getting that phosphorus to move down about half the depth of the tillage.
Yeah, but Darren, don't forget, you do tillage the next year, now you're half again, so now you might be down from 3, now you're down to 4.5. You do it again, you do it again, you do it again, you are moving some phosphorus down in the ground, and that's what we find. But if you're in no-till, for example, and you're laying the phosphorus on the soil surface, it is not getting into the soil hardly at all. Maybe an inch after a few years, that's about it. So that's the reason why we find a lot of nutrient stratification, where we've got a layer of phosphorus and then we have very little. So it's two problems. Number one, environmental, and number two, it's not where you need it for your plants.
All right, so how do we put on the phosphorus? For no-till guys, this is a big concern. Can I put it on in a 2x2, or can I drop some in furrow or something, at least so it's not on the soil surface? You certainly can, but you do have to keep in mind you haven't moved it very far, you're not going to be moving it any further, so that's going to be a long-term concern. We have talked to some no-tillers that say, you know what, about every so many years, I'm going to do some deep injecting, and it may be a slight amount of tillage. I really don't want to do it, but I got to do something to get phosphorus down deep. The observation has been made, and we've made the same observation on our farm, that we get root systems that are going down for that phosphorus, and we have a little better tolerance to drought and dry weather in the middle of the summer because our roots are getting what they need down deep in the soil.
And there's moisture down deep in the soil, so that's a big key. All right, so when you're pulling your soil test this fall, there are several different tests that can be run for phosphorus. The two that we really like are the Bray test and the Olsen test. The Olsen test we find as more accurate in higher pH soils, so anything above a 7, we tell you run an Olsen test. That'll tell you parts per million that is available in that soil. With the Bray test, we believe those are a little more accurate in lower pH soils. So anything below 7, you can run the strong Bray and the weak Bray. The weak Bray, or P1, is going to tell you available phosphorus. The strong Bray, or P2, is going to tell you available plus a portion of what's in reserve in the soil. So in other words, if you find you've got a tremendous amount in the P2 and very little in the P1, that tells you there's something kind of tying up your phosphorus in that soil. If you would address that, maybe it's a pH issue or some other nutrient in excess, if you address that, then more of that phosphorus will come available for free.
So let's just give you an example of how important this nutrient is. Let's say you had 250 bushel corn this year, and you pull up the Ag PhD fertilizer removal app, and you type in that 250 bushel corn, you see you're going to pull 127 pounds of phosphate out of the ground. 87 of those pounds leave with the grain at harvest time. That means if you didn't even put 87 pounds of phosphate out this year, you're going backwards. And if you're going to put soybeans in next season in this field and you figure, well, I've got a 2-year fertility program, you're going to really go backwards. So let's look at the phosphate that's on your soil test and start figuring out how much you actually have.
Okay, so just as a quick example here, let's say you pulled a 0 to 6 inch test. To convert parts per million to pounds per acre, you're going to multiply times 2. So let's say we have 10 parts per million. Multiply times 2, that's 20 pounds per acre of phosphorus. Now you're going to have to convert that to phosphate to be on the same page as even figuring out, all right, like MAP and DAP, for example. You got 18460 or 1152.0. The numbers there, the middle number, that is the phosphorus number, but it's not phosphorus, it's phosphate. So we always want to convert everything over to phosphate. So anyway, if I have 20 pounds of phosphorus in the ground, I multiply that times 2.3, so 20 times 2.3 is 46. So even though my soil test says 10 parts per million, I actually have 46 pounds of phosphate in my soil. Now, is that going to be enough for 250 bushel corn? Is it going to be enough for 150 bushel corn? No and no.
One other thing that you didn't calculate in, Brian, is that organic matter is going to mineralize each year, releasing some soil phosphate. We generally figure 4 to 7 pounds of phosphate is going to come available from each 1% of organic matter.
All right, last thing I want to leave you with, because a lot of people are dead set on, oh, phosphorus is bad for the environment. That's absolutely incorrect. In fact, we want more phosphorus, and that'll be better for the environment. Here's why. Because if a plant is short on phosphorus, the plant doesn't produce as much, doesn't produce as many roots, and guess what? Your organic matter levels theoretically could go down. We know it's better for the environment when our organic matter levels go up. So we want to have lots of phosphorus, but the problem with the phosphorus and the reason why we're having issues with water contamination is placement. It's where it's at. We've got to put the phosphorus down into the ground, and then we want to reduce erosion. So if we can virtually eliminate erosion, we place more of our phosphorus down in the ground, now we have fixed the environmental issue.
Having the right
The third nutrient we are looking to is potassium, abbreviation capital letter K. Potassium is very important for the quality of seed, fertility, and the strength and endurance of the plant. If you have a shortage on potassium, you have a lack on the right capacity for yield. And just like the other two nutrients, they are crucial for success. Now, I'd like you to watch this video about the role of potassium.
What's the third one? Well, I kind of hate that it's the third one, but it's potassium. I'm not saying nitrogen isn't important, phosphorus isn't important, but for our farm, our biggest yield limiting factor 10, 15, 20 years ago, heck, even 5 years ago, it was probably potassium. So we've talked an awful lot here over the last few years on Ag PhD about, you know what, it's not just parts per million. You got to have your potassium balanced in the soil, so look at your base saturation test. We want to see that number at least 4%, at least 4% K. So a lot of people have said, okay, first of all, why do I need potassium? Second, how do I get to the 4%? What's the math behind that? We're going to talk about those things today.
All right, clearly we need a lot of potassium in our crop. It's a nutrient that we need in large quantities. You can go to the Ag PhD fertilizer removal app. It's a free download for your smartphone or your tablet, and type in your crop and your yield goal. You'll see that for some crops we need hundreds of pounds per year that we've got to pull up out of the ground in order to have a successful crop. Now you may be looking at corn and you say, well, I'm not removing that much. That's not my grain removal. No, it's not. But you do need quite a bit of potassium for your stalks. And if you want to have good stalk quality all the way through harvest, you've got to have lots of potassium out there. Otherwise, you're going to start to see some lodging, you're going to see some plant cannibalization much earlier in the season, and it's just going to lead to poor yield and poor performance.
And the other thing is poor grain quality. When you start thinking about test weight and just the overall kernel, how healthy is that? What's it going to look like for fines and everything else at harvest? Hey, if you've got great potassium levels in that plant, you're going to have better grain quality in addition to better yields, in addition to better stalks, in addition to fewer diseases in that plant. Potassium is ultra critical.
Soils have a negative charge. We talk about this often when we're discussing soils. So they've got all these negative charges on the soil particles. Well, what do negative charges attract? Positively charged nutrients like potassium. When potassium is in a small percentage of those negative charge sites on the soil particles, well, you're not going to be able to find it. Your plant roots will not be able to get enough potassium quickly when you need it for crops, especially for a high demand crop like soybeans that needs a lot of pounds per acre per day of potassium when you're in the reproductive stages. The key to fixing this is increasing your percentage on these binding sites. We look at it on a soil test in the base saturation measurement. If you're below 4% base saturation potassium, that means less than 4% of those binding sites have potassium on them. Well, you're just not going to find enough in time to make the yield that you want to make. So we'd like to see your base saturation K 4% up to maybe 7 or 8% on the high side to get that ratio right.
One of the reasons why this is important in drier areas of the country as well is because if you don't have a lot of moisture, and keep in mind, these nutrients go in with moisture. If you don't have a lot of moisture, well, how are you going to get enough of that particular nutrient into the crop? You've got to have a lot of it just flat out in the soil. So we want to have a good ratio out there. We need to have quite a few parts per million, but again, it's got to be in ratio, because if you don't have enough in ratio, then there will be more magnesium, more calcium, more of something else getting into the plant instead of the potassium like you need. So let's just say, for example, you have 200 parts per million and you're at 2% base saturation K. All right, we need to get to 4%. That's pretty easy math. We just need to double the 200 parts per million, get up to 400 parts per million, and I'm not going to say it's going to be exact, okay? But that's going to get you relatively close. So what we usually encourage you to do is, if you want to hit it all in one shot and you can afford it, fine. But this is going to be a long-term investment. It's probably not going to pay off in year one. So if you own the ground, we're super interested in this as a long-term investment. If you're renting the ground, that's where it gets a lot tougher to changing the whole base saturation K thing. In fact, we've had discussions with our landlords to say, look, either we're going to need a long-term contract, or if you would pay for the extra potassium we need, we'll pay you more rent every year. But we know we can't recover all that extra potassium in 1 year. It's going to take 2 or 3 or 4 years. So we'll pay it off to you over time. We just don't want to put all that money out there and then lose the ground.
We get questions on the Ag PhD radio show almost every day about, Brian, Darren, help me calculate this out. I'm at 1.5% base saturation K and I've got 185 parts per million. How do I figure out how I would get it up to 4%? Well, your soil test, I guarantee, is going to have different numbers on it. But look at your parts per million, look at your percent base saturation K that you're currently at, and then figure out what your target is you're trying to go to.
Regardless of what any of these numbers are, here's just the general formula. What you want to look at is your current parts per million. Multiply that times 4, divide it by whatever your current base saturation is. Let's say it's 1.5. Okay, so you'd multiply it times 4 divided by 1.5. All right, so that tells you where you need to go in total, the total parts per million you need to get to. Now subtract off the parts per million you currently have. Okay, that tells you, all right, this is what I need to apply for parts per million. If we're talking pounds per acre, you need to just take a 6-inch soil test parts per million times 2. That'll give you pounds per acre, and that's how much actual potassium you would need to apply.
Again, as Brian said, you don't want to go broke doing this. Do what you can afford, especially on ground that you own and you know you're going to have long term, and step your way into this. It's not a great return on investment year one, but it's something that's going to pay off for many years to come.
The other
I provided you now a lot of information through these videos. I hope you will watch this video at least a few times before you make decisions on how much fertilizer you provide to your crop, what choices you make, and what kind of in long-term strategy you have with fertilization and organic material built up in your soil. Soil management is crucial for a successful farming. Thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you next time. If you have enjoyed it, please like and subscribe this channel. Thank you very much.